Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of our weekly live stream. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of our weekly live stream. Today's topic is feeling the emotions of racism and embracing feelings as a form of resistance. We're going to be discussing questions such as what's the importance of honoring the complexity of emotion, especially experienced by Black, Indigenous, and people of color in the wake of racial bias. To fit social norms, people grow up hearing things such as, don't be loud, don't be quiet, don't be angry, sad. And while this is true for most people, we recently discussed how this pressure is magnified by racism in one of our recent episodes. Emotional constraints placed by these communities contribute to an experience of dehumanizing, and it's all because of racial bias. So we'll discuss if people of multiple races are willing to honor one another's feeling and to feel and heal together. So let's hear more from this topic from our panelists. And we have our amazing panelists that I personally would love to hear from, and I hope you all do too. So I'd like to introduce you to Joshua Friedman, our CEO and moderator for today.
Thank you, Rawish. Thank you for the welcome. This is a difficult topic, and I want to just take a moment and appreciate you all for being here, and to say I'm feeling some excitement and also some fear in stepping into this conversation. And I was remembering on one of our panels, seems like years ago, but I think it was just a few weeks ago, that Princess Ayers Smith, at the end, we were talking about management and distance, the remoteness and racism and all of the complexity facing us as managers today. And she ended by saying, well, I guess we get to do it afraid. And that phrase has just been resonant for me when I feel this uncertainty, and the idea that that's okay. We don't need to know how to do it. We do need to do it. We do need to step forward. So with that, I would like to welcome two awesome panelists to our conversation. Karen and Charity are members of the 6 Seconds community, and people who I've had personal conversations with, well, for many years, but especially since the murder of George Floyd and the anti-racist uprising that's been happening. And Karen and I were talking about this, the dehumanizing effect of what happens when people are told you can't feel this and you can't feel that. So Karen and Charity, would you please introduce yourselves and tell us what's one emotion that you personally have been challenged to make friends with? Karen, you want to go first?
Sure. Glad to be here. Karen Craddock, I'm an applied psychologist, trainer, coach, facilitator, focusing on the social, cultural context of how we develop and grow, particularly in relationship. And for me, my work has really always operated at the nexus of health and education. I'm a co-founder of the Wellness Collaborative Incorporated, which is an interdisciplinary practice looking at how do we really elevate wellness overall. Visiting scholar at Wellesley College, and a member of the Aquinnah Wampanoag tribe of Gayhead Aquinnah. So, I think about this topic, and I think frustration, anger at the core is one of those emotions. You talk about befriending and understanding. And I think for me, because it pivots between the frustration, it feels very much like agitation, the possibilities of what could be or should be, coupled with just kind of utter rage and sadness. And oftentimes that has been dictated by what I have felt personally and what I witness regularly in the way of marginalization. Certainly people of African descent, Native Indigenous descent, other peoples of color and racialized groups that have historically and chronically been left out, marginalized, or in many ways minimized. And those emotions of frustration and anger swirl around. So at any given time, again, that can be energy producing to go out and push forward to make change. They also can be depleting and difficult to manage. So,
thanks, Karen. Charity, how about you?
Hi, I'm Charity Goodwin. I serve as the site pastor at Clayton for the Gathering United Methodist Church in St. Louis, Missouri. And so I love this question. I have to agree with Karen about the anger and finding ways just to learn what the anger is saying to me. And I think for me, I'm starting to see that clearly when I am in a space and feeling the anger, the frustration, in addition to the weariness, for me to know that there's something that this points to as a value. That clearly something that matters to me is being messed with. And so to really get at the heart, what's behind the anger for me, and being able to learn to identify that and know it and name it, so that I can know that I don't just feel angry, but I'm actually angry about something that really is important. And I think as a person who ebbs and flows in predominantly white spaces, as a pastor in a predominantly white denomination, there are lots of spaces to either express that or find ways to express it so that I can actually be heard. And so I think anger is definitely one of the keys for me.
Thanks, Charity. I wanted to just take a moment and say hello to people who are here in the chat and invite you to also think about this same question. What's an emotion that you've struggled to make friends with, an emotion that's been maybe up in your life and hard to understand? And Eric, thank you. Charity, Eric says, I hear you. And also, I appreciated this comment earlier, Eric, that I think this is a theme of today's conversation, is that discomfort can't be our limiting factor. And I think, Ryan, that courage is about stepping into what's hard. Karen or Charity, before you started doing the work of emotional intelligence, could you share a little bit about your lived experience with emotions? What was the message you heard growing up? What was the message? What were you, and what story were you telling about emotions?
That's, I think, a great question. Good things to think about. I feel truly, I think, privileged and honored in that I grew up in a family. I was raised in a family, extended family, where there was great value for emotions, for emotional being, and expression. And part of that was connected to being part of a very creative family, and continue to be, where having the ability to be in connection, in relationship with one another, but even more so within yourself. So making a room in our growing up daily lives for alone time, for reflection, and then for sharing that. Reflection was kind of a matter of course in my household. It was very common and across, I would say, across gender, both my brothers, my father, my mom, that we would talk about our feelings, how we were feeling, what came up. So it feels very much like it was kind of broad strokes, very embedded, and very connected to how it informed the choices we made. So I feel very fortunate in that way.
For me, definitely come from a very performance-based family background. And so if you're feeling something you don't want to feel, then just do something else and then the feelings will go away. And so I talk about really being an outperformer, being a doer, and learning perhaps over the last decade or so to integrate more of the being, that I'm a human being, right? Not a human doing. And this is a real unlearning for me. And so I would say for me, definitely, I had my breadth of emotions was happy, sad, and pissed. And so I still work on, I literally have to use a feelings wheel because I didn't even know that you could feel so many things. And so though that helps me to name, to have an emotional vocabulary for sure, is a space where I began to grow. So
I've shared on the live stream before that I think I was afraid of feelings. I grew up in a family that was pretty focused on intellectual pursuits, and the story that I heard, I don't know that anybody intended to tell me this story, but the story that I heard is that the smartest person in the room, and smart in quotes because it's just the IQ side, the smartest person in the room is the best person in the room, and that emotions really don't have a place in that conversation. So it was a pretty big shock for me to realize that feelings could be useful.
There's something that Charity said earlier about the feelings wheel. I really appreciated your kind of speaking to these, the tools that we're needing, the power of naming emotions. So I would say that, it's an interesting dynamic as I think about myself, like this was kind of an immersion in some ways, right? This living in this space where emotions were very fluid and accessible, but there's something else about having the specifics, here's some concrete tools, here's some ways that we can name it. And I found that to be incredibly useful in terms of bridge building, right? Being able to identify within yourself, but also be able to make a bridge to someone else. Mm-hmm. So that's just one concrete example. I appreciated your mentioning that, Charity. Absolutely.
Thanks, Karen.
So something I learned from my older child recently was the power of just noticing in the moment what you're physically feeling and naming that. Mm. And so I'm just curious if either of you would be willing to share, as we are kind of starting this conversation, what are you physically feeling right now? Can you feel emotions in your body?
Absolutely. I feel courageous, that I'm, in the arena of the conversation. And at the same time, there's a sense of this sort of measuredness, how far will I go? And just noticing like what is coming up, and even talking about anger has anger to sort of well up you feel it in your body. I feel it in my stomach. So. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I kind of feel this like, I don't know, instability in my spine. I feel this like this a little bit of wobbliness, and I'm actually sitting. I find myself holding onto my chair with my other hand. Oops, we just lost Karen. Technology trouble. Hopefully, Karen will come back momentarily. But it's kind of amazing that so much is happening. Mm-hmm. Okay, let's get Karen back here. Hi again, Karen.
Sorry, hi.
Technology glitch. How about you? What are you physically feeling?
Yeah, I think a gripping in the center of my chest, a real gripping in the center of my chest, and it's not lost on me that the week that we're in, and then the unfortunate mounting of ever yet more brutality and violence of all kinds. The physical and psychic violence I think that we're experiencing individually and collectively is something that is felt in the body. So I'm feeling that in the center of my chest. Yeah.
And what do you think those physical experiences of feeling, what are they telling you?
Mm-hmm. So I think it's this, it kind of harkens back to what I was saying about the frustration and the anger. The information is one of the overwhelming, enough is enough. Mm. The weariness that Charity spoke of earlier, So it's very weighted. It feels very heavy. And so this, again, is a pivot point of, can't succumb to the weight, but I'm feeling the weight and needing a place to say, this is too much, right? This is a lot. It's a lot. And then it being fuel again for action. So it's just interesting. It can feel like a dichotomy of both disabling or just kind of the heaviness of it, but as well as a fuel, as a catalyst, right? If that makes sense. And oftentimes I think where these emotions play out, things that would seemingly be polarized are conflated, right? They're combined in our bodies and in our minds. So in and of itself, that's so very complex to deal with. It's both catalyst and weight.
I'm sure everybody has heard about Jacob Blake's shooting. And, for me, I think if I'm really honest, what happens is I see that and I just push it away because it's too much. It feels like too much. How do I process this? How do I handle this? Let me just keep scrolling. And I don't think that's who I want to be. I don't want to scroll past suffering and injustice and wrongness. And it feels really overwhelming.
It's in that trying to be courageous in the space of discomfort. And I don't know about you, Charity, but I often think I'm in conversations a lot these days around that, right? And I think of power and choice oftentimes when these emotions come up. And, as folks you're certainly not alone in feeling that level of suffering and wanting to scroll past. And then there are those who the option to do so isn't available, right, in the same way. But the emotion of wanting to, of needing to protect yourself or care for yourself is human, right? We would talk about just being the humanity of it. But when it's all day, every day, current and chronic for people, Black, Indigenous, people of color, it isn't a luxury, if you will, to kind of be able to scroll past. Yet and still here we are all collectively in pain, right?
Yeah, I recognize that is part of white privilege for me, is that I don't have to think about it.
Yeah, I think, it's important. One of my important learnings around emotions is that you can have multiple, emotions at the same time, right? That I don't have to just choose the one that I'm most comfortable with. And so I think even in the sense of continuing, and I love your language, Karen, about chronic and current and chronic. I think that's phenomenal to name it in that way. Is that, whether you do it in the scroll or you do it later, I do think there's space in this work for the engagement, and there's space in this work for, the pullback, the time of reflection, the time of rest. I think particularly as a person who's impacted by the work, by racism, have to just find that space where I too have to turn it off so that I can regroup, refresh, rest, be renewed, be in community that matters, etc., in order to come back to it and engage it in various ways. And so I think if there's a measure of, you see it, maybe you scroll past it, but you're coming back to this, and that you're going to make space and time to engage and not completely disengage. I think that's important.
One of the people that I was coaching earlier this year is a first generation to college Latinx person. And she was describing to me this experience of growing up hearing literally, there's no time for your feelings. Like you have to, you need to get to work, you need to get to college, you need to get a job. And then in her late 20s saying, okay, I did that, but now maybe there is time for my feelings. One of my people in one of the classes I was teaching, the Black man, said, I didn't realize how intensely my culture has told me not to feel. And I'm wondering, in your coaching, in your counseling, in your work, what are you hearing from other Black, Indigenous, and people of color about what's the themes that you're hearing around being able to feel?
That's a heavy one for sure. There's a lot there. So I guess I'm thinking about a couple of things. So surely there's something, and you talk about the young woman that you were coaching, this needing to press on, to survive, to be resourceful and resilient in order to survive is, I think, it's a common refrain, it's a common reality for people who've been historically marginalized. And while it is a source of great strength and pride, we've had to, and not only have survived, but have thrived. Mm-hmm. There is this suppressing, right? This kind of needing to back burner the emotions, the very real, multiple emotions that we're feeling in order to go forward. And so for me, I think what's coming up just in some of the work I've done on relational brain science, or just understanding the mind-body connection, I'm often thinking and hearing and seeing this, the fragmentation. We think about the different brain states, this, the survival brain state, of just fight, flight, freeze, this, and that's asking the question, am I safe, right? And then our emotional state, which is that limbic portion of, am I loved? Am I connected? And then that executive, the thinking part, I just got to do and think and rational. What am I learning? And that as for people of color, Black, Indigenous people of color, the breadth and the opportunity to feel and experience all three of those things in an integrated way. Often in that you're in survival state. I got to do this. We got to survive. It doesn't mean that these don't exist, but the opportunity to fully experience and live those out in an integrated way, it's making room and time for that for sure. But I found that the cost has been in this fragmented state. Didn't even know you had the feelings because you weren't allowed to even just rest. I love what Charity said, making time to rest and reset and to think so you can experience that part. I think the way it shows up is in our bodies. We know that we're health disparities physically and mentally amongst communities of color are incredibly glaring and growing, right? Maternal health and well-being, infant mortality rates, high blood pressure, diabetes, we know that these things are chronic, and we know that they're also living in our bodies because I think that they're connected to our mind and our hearts.
I'm just reminded of our think, feel, act triangle in what you were talking about, and somehow in the middle is that space of integration,
right?
Integration of self,
right,
versus disintegration of self.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, we can come back to this later, but it seems like that disintegration of self is a form of disempowerment that's intentional.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That a system that doesn't want disruption disintegrates people who might oppose that system.
Yeah, I agree with Karen around, this space around what people are needing that I'm finding. And I would say a lot of these would be some colleagues, but also women of color in corporate, America in various ways, or who are living and functioning in, particularly working in predominantly white spaces. Sometimes folks just need a place to lament. We see it all happen and we do feel it, but a place to come and really be able to vocalize and internalize, take on the posture of oh Lord, I would say, right? Like, and how long? And so there's need to create space for some of my particularly sisters who we have space where we can just come and say the things that we can't say that we feel every day. And that has been a space of healing. I think we function in brave space all day. My very existence is resistance to all that is happening in the world. And it's brave space every day I wake up and go out into the world. But then to create what I would call the safe space, right? We often want safe space, but to be in the safe place where I can really say how hard this is and how you can love people that you serve or support, and to try to find just the right ways to push enough and not too much. So to be able to speak that truth to power and to speak the truth in love are things that are held in this tension, right? Every day as I live and do my work and exist in the world.
And again, that sounds exhausting.
Absolutely. So rest is even radical, right? Rest is resistance. I mean, to say no to someone who wants me to come and, speak or do some other things, that's a form of resistance. It's a form of saying, no, I'm going to, be home and do the things that my children need and desire, that, I won't be seen as just, whatever, a Black woman who can contribute, but also a mom who can be present with her children in a real way and not be so tired that I can't.
Yeah. Powerful. And it's first day of school this week. So, an extra big thank you for being here today.
No, not intended toward this. I agreed to do this. I do think it's an important conversation, and I think specifically because, to talk about the feelings around anger, because they're real. And I guess one of the things I'll just say, and we can move on, I think it's really important that for me, I want to work with people who are angry about what's happening. Right? Like, I really want to be clear that I don't want people to feel bad. I don't want to, we talked about how does it land for someone to say, I didn't know, or I was shocked. Like, I get it. And at the same time, this isn't the place to come to have your privilege pitied, right? Or just forgiven right at the onset. But I want you to be angry enough that it's of value enough that you would move to action, right? So that's why I agree to be a part of the conversation. Because I feel like that's critical. And if we're not bringing that to the table, then, we ain't in the same fight at the end of the day.
I appreciate it.
I love what you said, Charity, and that anger. I mean, what I really hear you saying is that, yes, we should be angry. And if, I think many of us are afraid of anger. We're afraid of other people's anger. We're afraid of our own anger. But courage means we're going to do it anyway. We're not just going to be compassionate. We're also going to be angry. But just hearing you say that, I again, coming back to my body, I feel this heat when you say those words. And but there's this piece of me that then goes, this isn't the place. This isn't the time.
That's
like it's not now, when, right? Go ahead.
right. That's the dehumanizing impact, right? And this is where I feel like issues of racism or oppression or the conversations, the system of racism really is dehumanizing not only, to the targeted, it's the perpetrator and the witness bearer. It is the bystander, targeted, and the perpetrator. It is it's the function of it. Especially as it's connected to emotions, where there is this policing and monitoring of what emotions are allowed and are not. Certainly, we know that there's the historic tropes for Black people and Black folks, this being an angry person. There's the whole loud, angry Black woman. I mean, this is an actual phrase, right? That it's a turn of phrase understood, where you were to minimize, you're to hold that back. So righteous anger, understanding that is necessary fuel for action, and where this has been constrained or disallowed is a dehumanization. And I would say what I'm also seeing and needs to, I think, to be more formally named is racism's function as a dehumanizing factor for whiteness, of white folks who are perpetrating white privilege or supremacy, and that there's this minimization where it's less about being human and it's around identity that's connected to whiteness and white supremacy. There's something about that it's minimizing, right? What I see, like when fear and shame are hidden, I think it can lead to violence, right? So violence of all kinds, physical violence, psychic violence, emotional violence. And those are the emotions that I've seen, certainly white friends, colleagues, others witnessing it on television, where those emotions don't necessarily rise up. I'm afraid, I feel ashamed, right? And if they're hidden, I do think that's where it emerges in violence. But when they can surface, I think that's a space of vulnerability, right? We know Brené Brown and others in this space, vulnerability is at the heart of being human, right? For me, I believe that that's where empathy and compassion can bloom, right? So it's like that fear, shame, vulnerable to space, and to name that, that's part of getting in touch with the humanity that white folks, I think, who might be practicing or benefiting from white privilege, there's that whole realm. Not even talking about Black, Indigenous, and people of color who've been targeted by it and minimized in terms of what emotions are allowable. So I think looking at this, the breadth of it is going to be critical for action.
In one of our other streams, Camilla Drummond Foster said that our inner work, our heart work, is reclaiming our humanity.
Right.
Whatever race we're in, reclaiming our humanity. I think shame is a really important emotion for us to talk about here, both from as a white person, but I imagine it's a feeling that comes up for people of a lot of races. Shame about, in my case, shame about I haven't done enough, I haven't acknowledged enough, I've been too complacent. Shame, one of our board members, Ayman Swaf, says shame is anger turned inwards. And that when we see there's an obstacle, anger is about an obstacle, right? When we see that there's an obstacle and that we see the obstacle as ourselves and we feel powerless, we turn that shame inward, and it shifts from being a moral emotion, an emotion that tells us about do better, to an emotion of retribution, basically. I can't do better, so I'm going to beat myself up. I'm going to tear myself down. And I don't think we're built for that.
Yeah.
Charity?
Sure, as there's a space in the conversation around shame, around common humanity. And being able to name that wherever you are, that you're not the only one experiencing that, and that there isn't this space of isolation. And so, earlier when I talked about creating spaces for women of color and being able to have that sort of community, one of the real needs I believe that many people have, but what shows up in those conversations is a need for some self-empathy, self-compassion, and we've already talked about rest. I think what's different, while everyone can, be exhausted and tired and shamed and feel shame, how we come to it, I think the layers are different, right? The layers or the reasons for that are different. And so when it's systemic, there's a type of having the self-empathy and the self-compassion and the rest, so that you can then live to fight another day, if you will. So there's space of resistance. But I think the space of common humanity, that we all feel all these things, and that we can tap into it, even though I think our reasoning behind some of the reasons we feel the way we feel are indeed different.
I wanted to come to this comment from Ryan. And I think, this is something the three of us were discussing a little bit earlier before the show. The luxury of feelings. And I talked about this on one of our other streams, that maybe emotional expression is a form of privilege, and maybe emotional expression is a form of resistance. But we're in a system. This didn't just happen suddenly. Karen, what do you hear? What are you reading in Ryan's comment here?
Thank you, Ryan, for it. So even just this knowing your place, I think, is speaking to the very systems of oppression that are intentionally built. I think Charity mentioned this earlier too. This is like by design, right? So structural racism is very real and felt, such that the even naming of place speaks to a hierarchy, right? So even the turn of phrase, know your place, means there is an absolute hierarchy here. I'm naming it. And in your place, there is no space for emotion. So the luxury of emotion, again, this has been put upon. So these power over structures that are designed specifically to name that there are certain individuals that can or cannot be allowed the full expression of what it means to be human, meaning the full breadth of emotions that you can feel, is by design, right? So as we're reading, and again, it's not just in Ibram Kennedy's work, Resma Menakem's work, My Grandmother's Hands, we're talking about the somatic realities of what it means to understand racism and oppression, and to dismantle it. This idea of dismantling is an action that first comes from naming and understanding that this is a structure and a system that by design has been put in place. And so much of it hinges on, this space of emotional expression. That it's not uncommon hearing the know your place often comes after there's been some level of emotional expression, or when you've named yourself in a space, or you've resisted by expressing, stating, feeling something, and then you are quickly reminded where you are, right?
I see often in corporate spaces, not so much around racialized communication or communication around race and emotion, but just it seems pervasive of when somebody is vulnerable, what will often happen is somebody will make a joke. Mm-hmm. And they'll say, oh, I guess it's going to be group therapy today. And that discomfort with emotion. I don't know that it's designed per se. I don't know that it's anybody sat down and said, yeah, we're going to perpetuate the, status quo by suppressing emotion. And yet emotion tells us we need to grow, we need to change, we need to shift, we need to wake up. Something is wrong. Emotion's telling us that. And a system that likes to stay the same doesn't want that.
So that inextricable, I think, connection of emotions and humanity, what it means to be human, I think, in fact, it is by design in some ways, right? You can't separate the two. So if I'm going to view this other individual as less than me, one of the surefire ways to do that is to not acknowledge and to disallow your humanity by the full expression of that, particularly when it comes to your emotions, I imagine.
So if I'm putting away my emotions and telling somebody else to put away their emotions, now we don't have to interact as human beings.
I don't have to view you as one, for sure. And we know there's this ongoing research and understanding of pain, right? The unacknowledged pain that often happens for Black folks, and particularly even in healthcare settings. So this is research that has been well documented, particularly African-American people in an ER experiencing pain are given less pain medication than a white, person for the same exact experience, or stating as such. There's some very sad studies done with even young children being able to discern pain in their peers by age 7. At 5 years old, they can kind of see all of my classmates are hurting or in pain. By 7, it starts to drop off, particularly by race, even by skin tone and color. And that has got to come from somewhere. We're in a society that is informing there are certain bodies or individuals that are seen as more valuable and thus more human, and thus I can read and understand their emotional space, their pain. It's, and there's just the ongoing reality of experiencing that. But then we're back to the top of the conversation of witnessing that, witnessing people of color, Black bodies, literally being treated as less than, and the pain that that invokes, right? And then have it not acknowledged. So this combination of being invisible and in pain, and your pain being invisible, that's very complex and deeply harrowing. So you'd imagine there's a societal structure of racism that is contributing to that. You know, it's ongoing, and that's why it calls for being anti. The energy that, you know, Charity says, I want to work with angry people. People are angry enough to do something about it. It calls for action, for dismantling it.
Charity, what do you make of this from a faith perspective? You're, as a pastor, what's the connection to this rehumanizing or acknowledging of humanity and emotions?
So some of the things that I think are that I think too often we don't think that to have emotions is to be human. And that then translates into sort of the space of Jesus, where people don't always even acknowledge Jesus's emotions, rather Jesus's his actions, or to say that, but Jesus, fully divine, but we maybe not hold on to the fully human space, and almost discounted his tears, him naming emotions in scripture, in common stories, naming, for example, Martha's anxiety in the story between Mary and Martha. We see the things that Jesus does, but we don't always acknowledge perhaps his emotions, and therefore, when we don't do that, then we think to be like Jesus is therefore not to have them, or to just do the thing, whatever those actions are. And so I think that our very idea, our understanding and concept of who God is lacking. Therefore, is lacking in emotional space. I definitely would hold, I would say, a different sort of a view of God, in that I believe that that God feels what we feel, and there are people who might not use that as a wouldn't hold that as a tenet, but for me, it is. I don't believe in the God that sits high and looks low and watches everything that happens here, or is a puppet and is making everything to happen by, a turn of a hand. Rather, God is experiencing this with all of us, and feels the same pain, joy, and all those things alongside us. So I think that is definitely a different understanding of God than maybe you might hear in a mainline sort of Protestant space. But it's one that I think allows me to incorporate and integrate, hopefully more and more, what it means to be an emotional being.
Yeah, I was at a conference. I was invited to chair a conference on emotional and spiritual intelligence in Dubai in 2003 or something. And it was my first time in the Gulf, and it was an amazing experience in many ways. But one of the people who were speaking there said, what if emotions are the way God speaks to us? Because, we feel this spiritual, we feel that when we're in a spiritual place. I wanted to just bring Karma's comment in here. And I think this is a really big issue. Charity, you have a thought about?
Yeah, Karma, I get it. I hear you. That sometimes we can we question our own feelings or thoughts about things. I think that's the system at hand. I think that is a direct reflection of us, of people who have felt marginalized in whatever way that looks, not to trust oneself, and not to have even community who you can, sometimes needing the community to say you're not crazy. I find like I'm often calling my friends like, hey, check this out. Am I crazy? Like, check me if I'm wrong. And so there is this space, right, that this has become so internalized that we can become uncertain of ourselves. And so I think having some folks to bounce things off of, I think continuing to grow in your own courage, in your own knowing, and trusting your knower, trusting that stuff that happens in your body. For me, I had what I call an emotional heart attack. I didn't trust my emotions until I thought I was dying one day, like in my body. And so I think to begin to trust what is happening on the inside, and therefore trusting you, I think and that takes time. But keep putting it to the test, and you'll begin to see, like, I was right about this. And then the more you're right about it, the more you'll be able to trust yourself in it.
Mm-hmm.
I think this piece about trusting our own emotions is a really important challenge. I mean, we all are emotionally dumb sometimes. I mean, I'm emotionally dumb sometimes, right? And I'm like overreacting or underreacting. And so I think that has led me to this storyline of like, push emotions aside, they're not reliable. And then I've had to learn something new in the last 20 years. Trusting your own feelings in a system that, in an environment, in a context that says, don't feel.
Uh-huh.
That's the challenge before us. And I completely agree with that, like checking in with people. Am I crazy? Is this in my head? Is this just me? Is a common experience, right? And I do think it can be by design, which is, I love what, you're mentioning, Charity, is also having spaces, trusted spaces, healthy relationships and connections, affinity group, folks where you don't have to explain yourself and you can check in with to both rest and reset, and to give you that affirmation and strengthen that muscle to trust yourself, to trust the emotions you're feeling. It's a critical piece of this, for sure.
I wanted to bring, I wanted to bring this comment in from Dwayne. And I think this is a really interesting part of the work the three of us are all involved in.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody want to talk about that?
Go ahead.
I was going to mention that the emotions wheel that we started talking about at the beginning, and that because emotions aren't necessarily, Josh, to your point, commonplace, even in the ways, general society has necessarily valued emotions and such, so that, we understand completely that this isn't part of our usual regular lexicon, that there are several different variations within one emotion, and we're not necessarily readily equipped. But I like the idea of starting where we are, and being in connection. Again, this is, I think, critical to the work that I do and see as a relational-based work when it even comes to health and education or learning. Having safe and brave spaces to begin to say, this is the beginning of what I'm starting to feel, and then try to expand that, to build on that. In and of itself is an exercise in stretching your vocabulary, even if you don't have the exact word just yet, describing the experience, even the frustration and not quite knowing all of what I'm feeling. I was recently in a conversation with someone around the differences between feeling wistful and feeling hopeful. Right? Those can sound kind of broad, but we got to the place of there's a luxury of emotions and feeling wistful that's attached to somehow being free. That wistful kind of invokes a sense of wonder or imagination, whereas hopeful, there's a sense of more of determination and resistance. And there was just such a little shade, just a little difference there, but hopeful being more about having faith and vision, right? So we talk particularly around racialized groups, or certainly even just cultural, indigenous, Native, and African diasporic communities, where having vision and faith and hope, a belief in things not seen, is coming from a place of determination, but maybe in a context where you didn't have the luxury or the freedom to imagine in a particular way, to be wondering, this level of freedom. So it was a really interesting conversation we ended up having just on two words of being wistful and hopeful. And exercising in community, having conversation about it, and getting to this broader understanding. Wow, that's really a different point of view. And maybe there are different communities that have had the opportunity to experience some of these other spaces. They're similar, but not quite the same. But that brought us to a whole other level of understanding. So I would just say encouraging meeting ourselves where we are and being in community and connection and having conversation around it. Yeah.
And even just saying, I'm feeling something.
Mm-hmm.
I might not know what it is.
Right.
I think one of the challenges here is culture is so deeply embedded. You know, in our norms, it's so hard to see what is really me, what are my real beliefs, and what's in the system. Systems, it's not one culture, it's many cultures, layers and layers of cultures that we're in. And being able to say, like, I don't buy that anymore. I don't buy the message that I can't feel. I don't buy the message that people are different or less than or more than because of skin color. I don't buy the message that I shouldn't eat raw fish or like whatever, like whatever the thing is. Like, but those norms are so deeply embedded. And how do we step out of everyone knows? Like, I go to my friends and say, am I crazy? And they're like, yeah, you're crazy because everyone knows that you shouldn't feel X, or everyone knows that. You know.
I agree that it's a muscle. I was just looking at a comment in the comments about how feelings can vary based on external circumstances, not always in our control. So to trust your emotions all the time may be unsettling. We need a core standard to base our behavior on. And I guess my first thing would be like says who? I mean, I think for me to know that I can trust what I'm feeling. Now, what I choose to do with what I'm feeling, I still have agency, ownership, etc. But I think that's the beauty of, right? That it's not mathematic. It's not a formula. It is life. It is organic. It is lived out. You might trust something that you may feel trust of a feeling and act on it, and then it didn't turn out the way you had hoped. I don't think that is necessarily failure. I think this is I think what it is to practice living, to practice being human. So I hear you. From the comment from Malayo, I hear you there, and I think it's something that perhaps cannot be standardized, and it has to be lived out as lived experience. That's where I would go initially on that.
The inner knowing and our job here is to live and learn and grow.
I've been looking to the creatives. I think that's where I'm finding myself more. It's the artist's voice, taking that in and really looking to that. I think James Baldwin has a quote that says, an artist is a sort of emotional and spiritual historian, right? So the emotions are critical as a clarion call. Or there's a poet philosopher, David White, talks about emotions as a map to humanity, right? And so that looking to this creative space, our creative expression, there's something really powerful in that. I think looking to those artists who are leading the way, that are providing, I think, platform and fodder and catalyst for us to reclaim what it means to be truly human and reclaiming our emotional and the bandwidth to express all of that is going to be very, very important. So this kind of interdisciplinary space that we need, this alchemy of artists and scientists and spirit, and there's something in that feels like liberation. There's something in that feels like the real transformation that's going to lead us out. I know that Wynton Marsalis is a new 7-part series. There's the Funky Lowdown, but in it, there's a naming of what's happening systemically, right? And that we're all in this space, that there's a hustle and a game, some illusion that has caused this oppression or fragmentation, that if we can all, kind of listen and understand that, be acutely aware of one another as human beings, that's our way out. So the artist, I said, we've got to look to the creative spaces as a real place for transformation.
I wanted to just appreciate this comment from Deborah, and Deborah's made several comments in the chat. Thank you, Deborah. This really spoke to me, and I felt that this, when this current uprising, I don't know when it started. I was going to say when it started, but I think it probably started long before June. But in June, I was my first reaction was like, we're in the middle of a pandemic. We cannot also deal with restructuring our society and eliminating racism. That's like one too many things. And now I feel the opposite way. I'm so grateful for the chance to have these conversations, and that even though we're stuck at home, even though our lives are disrupted, maybe because our lives are disrupted, we can have these conversations. We do have this space to say, wait a minute, there's something really important to do right now. And I just feel really grateful that we can do this, this inner work. We maybe can't go to work, but we can do this inner work. So what's one step that we can take going forward? For all of us on watching the recording and here live, what's one step?
I'll go first, Karen. I think, centering voices other than your own is something that is really important at this time. And that could look like book reading. It could look like, listening to a panel of folks that look different than you. And I just believe we need to approach those conversations with an expectation that there is going to be truth spoken. Because I think that in the enlightenment sort of, modernization, if you will, of things, we approach conversations to really be critical, and that's a good task to have. I mean, that's the critical thinking is important. But as people share their stories, as people share what is truth for them, I think if we can approach some things with a little more grace, to trust that people are sharing what is real for them. Instead of being too quick to discount what we might be hearing. And so centering marginalized voices, having an understanding of what's happening in the world, but, listening to someone else talk about it from who stands in a different location, right? Identity is around where we are located and situated, and always talking to people who are deemed in the center is not always helpful. And you'll get new breath, I think, an entirely new perspective.
That term, centering voices, like really bringing into the middle of our conversations, into the middle of our reading, into the middle of our thinking. Mm-hmm. I just went on Twitter and started following the founders of Black Lives Matter and the people who they follow, and just said, okay, I need different voices in my head. I need different voices in my heart.
Yeah, on your Twitter feed. I mean, like, just what we're exposed to every day is concocted, right, by who we choose to follow, et cetera, right? So we're getting one sort of perspective, or this one situated space of information and knowledge and reality. And we know that reality is multifold in that respect. So I think, and then I would just encourage people to do something with it. Someone talked once about maybe we don't need to learn anything else. Maybe we just need to unlearn some stuff. And so I think we can get really honed in on reading and intellectualizing racism and never do a dang on thing. And so my challenge would be, what's one thing you would do even from this conversation? What's one thing you'll try to do in light of what you've heard today? Because if we're not going to do nothing, then what's the point of talking?
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's a little challenge for everyone in the chat. What's one thing you're going to do with what you've heard today? Karen, how about you? What's your
hearing? Yeah, I was thinking, and I completely agree and appreciate all that Charity said. I think that where I'm focusing on is I'm thinking about the inner work. I think the individual inner work, and then the inner work, and meaning in the communal spaces. And I think my attention, there's certainly for those who need to learn or unlearn some things, but I think my present focus, or the one thing that we can do, and I would say specifically for communities, Black, Indigenous, people of color communities, hearkening back to this place of the reset, of the rest, of affinity space, turning our energies in ways that are reclaiming our relational, cultural, indigenous practices and beliefs is going to be really important in this time. That it's going to be, I think you said, this is multifold, right? Multifaceted. This is a work of heart and of real action. And it's going to mean a lot of different plays in a lot of different ways. For me, I would say that we make sure that the folks who have been managing these spaces of anti-Blackness or anti-indigeneity or all of these racialized marginalization spaces, doing the inner work, coming within our community and reclaiming the space of restoration, reclamation, honoring stewardship over dominion, right? So we know that part of this whiteness or racism is a construct of dominion and power over, that then as people of color and indigenous folks, reclaiming our stewardship of ourselves, of our bodies, of our land, of our culture, as an act of resistance, and it's making sure that we're doing that. So I would encourage us, in those spaces and in our communities, while there's this anti-racism work going on, that there's also this reclamation work that needs to happen as well within communities of color.
I think for me, the piece that I have been focusing on recently has been about looking at my own use of power and that shifting to together with even more. I think I've been doing it, but I think even more. And the piece about welcoming, not just tolerating, welcoming the emotional complexity. And I appreciate, I think was Ryan in the chat, I think, is talking about it's hard to have conversations about police. It's hard to have conversations about a lot of things without big feelings. And I can listen to big feelings, and I don't need to be afraid of that. So with that, Charity and Karen, really appreciate you giving us this gift of your presence and time and feelings. And all of you who are here in the chat, I'm grateful for seeing the conversations happening there and your participation. And I think with that, we're at the end and back to Rawish to wrap up.
Wow, such an inspiring conversation. One of the things I really liked is the power of naming emotions and talking about it, and knowing that we don't have to just talk about the emotions that we're not comfortable with, and just being open to the idea that, in order to move forward, such conversations are so important to change the way things have been going on for such a long time. And these conversations are no doubt very difficult, but having these conversations can empower us to overcome big issues in our society, such as racism. Well, thank you to all the panelists for this amazing discussion. We saw some really good comments in the chat section too. Please continue to share your thoughts, your experiences, and your takeaways from today's session in the comment section below. And we'd love to hear from you and what you think about today's session. And please share our video and help us reach more people. Thank you for joining us and being part of our discussion today. See you next week with another topic, same day, same time. Thank you.
If this was helpful, would you please comment, like, share, and subscribe? The Emotional Intelligence Network is your community to grow and practice EQ. At 6 seconds, that means being smarter with feelings. And we're here to provide practical, proven EQ tools so workplaces, schools, and people can thrive everywhere in the world. Be sure to visit 6seconds.org to find the complete suite of resources, assessments, and programs. Thank you for watching.